Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're looking closely at Recep Tayyip Erdoğan. His political journey has really defined modern Turkey, hasn't it?
Absolutely. Over 2 decades in top roles, Istanbul mayor, prime minister, now president. It's quite a run.
And our goal here is to unpack some of that, especially the controversies, the consolidation of power, using the materials we've gathered. There's a lot beneath the surface.
For sure. We'll be digging into his early days, the AKP's rise, those big moments like Gezi Park, the corruption stuff, the 2016 coup attempt.
Right, and the move to the presidential system, too. That was huge.
Huge. And then the impact, the crackdowns, the economy, foreign policy moves, even claims of nepotism. It all shapes this, well, very divisive legacy he's building.
It's complex stuff. Crucial to understand, though, given Turkey's role.
Definitely. It helps to grasp what's happening not just in Turkey, but, in the wider region and globally.
Okay, so let's rewind. Early political life. He started with the Islamist Welfare Party.
That's right. But it was really his time as Istanbul's mayor, what was it, 94 to 98. That's when he stepped into the spotlight.
And the sources suggest he built this image as a reformer back then.
Yeah, focusing on practical things, modernization projects in the city, trying to tackle corruption. It gave him this reputation for getting things done.
Which is interesting, yeah, because it contrasts a bit with later criticisms.
It does. But even then, his Islamist background caused friction with Turkey's secular establishment. The parts of the state, the military, the judiciary, committed to keeping religion and state separate.
And that friction led to his imprisonment in '99 for reciting a poem.
Exactly. The authorities saw the poem as inflammatory, challenging the secular order. So off he went to jail.
And that jail time, it almost backfired on the establishment, didn't it? It kind of pointed him as a victim.
Precisely. For his supporters, it was proof he was being persecuted by the old guard, the secular elite. It actually fueled his rise, ironically.
Then came 2001, the founding of the AKP, the Justice and Development Party.
Right. And they were very careful with the branding moderate conservative.
That seemed like a deliberate move to appeal more broadly, beyond just the Islamist base.
Absolutely. Position themselves as something new, different from the old welfare party. Still conservative, still appealing to traditional values, but less overtly religious in its rhetoric.
But our sources show critics saw that differently. Like maybe it was just a strategy.
Yeah, the criticism was, and still is, that this moderation was maybe a cover, a way to gradually chip away at Turkey's secular foundations over the long term. It raises questions about political strategy, doesn't it?
It really does. And the AKP's rise was incredibly fast. They won big in the 2002 elections.
Swept into power. And initially, there was a lot of positive buzz internationally.
Right. Talk of economic reforms, a push towards the EU. They had quite a bit of support back then.
They did. But as we dig into the materials, you start seeing other trends emerge, especially concerning, well, democratic norms, media freedom, judicial independence.
Yeah. The alleged weakening of those institutions seems to run parallel to the AKP solidifying its power.
It seems that way. The accusations around media suppression are pretty striking. Arrests of critical journalists, government takeovers of independent news outlets.
And the media landscape became dominated by pro-government voices.
Overwhelmingly so, according to the reports. And you see Turkey's press freedom rankings plummet during this period. That's usually a worrying sign.
It wasn't just the media either, was it? There were changes in the judiciary, too.
No, the judiciary came under pressure as well. Sources point to appointments of loyalists to key judicial posts, restructuring the body that oversees judges and prosecutors.
The implication being that this weakened checks and balances made it harder to scrutinize the government.
That's the core criticism, that it reduced judicial independence and potentially shielded the administration. It concentrates power in the executive.
Which, is often seen as a step toward more authoritarian-style rule, controlling the message in the courts.
They're powerful tools for maintaining control, definitely. Suppressing dissent becomes much easier.
Okay, moving to 2013. Gezi Park. That felt like a real turning point.
It really did. It started so small, didn't it? Just a local protest about developing a park in Istanbul.
But it just exploded.
Yeah.
It became this nationwide thing against what people saw as his government's growing authoritarianism.
Exactly. It tapped into this wider unease. And the government's response, well, it was forceful.
Yeah, the materials describe pretty brutal police crackdowns, tear gas, mass arrests,
And Erdoğan himself framed the protesters very harshly, called them enemies of the state, vandals, that sort of thing.
which just deepened the divisions in Turkish society, didn't it?
Absolutely. It really laid bare those fault lines, and it brought a lot of international condemnation down on the government's tactics.
So it seems like that moment marked a shift, a move towards more overt authoritarianism, perhaps, less focus on that earlier reform image.
I think that's a fair assessment based on the sources. Gidzi showed a clear readiness to use state power to crush dissent. It signaled a hardening, a departure from those early AKP years.
Then, also in 2013, the corruption scandals hit. Those leaked recordings.
Yeah, alleging really significant misconduct involving Erdoğan himself, his family, his inner circle. The scale was pretty vast.
So how did he handle those accusations? They sounded incredibly damaging.
His response was swift and aggressive. He labeled the tapes fakes, part of a conspiracy.
And then went after the people investigating.
Exactly. Purged police officers, prosecutors, judges who were involved. It effectively shut down the investigations.
But it must have damaged public trust, even if he sidelined the legal challenges.
It certainly deepened distrust among his opponents and critics, but it also showed his resilience, his ability to weather these major storms and push back hard.
Fast forward to July 2016, the coup attempt. A really chaotic, violent night.
Extremely tense. A faction in the military tried to seize power, failed, obviously.
But Erdoğan used the aftermath, didn't he, to consolidate power even further.
Massively. He declared a state of emergency, which gave him broad powers. And then came the purges.
The scale of those purges was just enormous, based on the reports.
Tens of thousands. People in the military, judiciary, academia, media, civil service, arrested, suspended, fired. It was unprecedented in modern Turkey.
And the government blamed followers of Fethullah Gulen.
Yes, they accused Gulen's movement of orchestrating the coup. Critics, though, argued Erdoğan used the coup attempt as a pretext, almost a justification, to eliminate not just coup plotters, but all sorts of opposition and dissent.
It certainly cemented his control, which leads us to the 2017 referendum.
Another huge turning point. This referendum changed Turkey's whole system of government.
From a parliamentary system to an executive presidency.
Exactly. And this new system concentrated immense power in Erdoğan's hands. The power to rule by decree, much more control over appointing judges. Parliament's oversight role was significantly reduced.
It basically dismantled the old checks and balances.
Largely, yes. And the referendum itself was controversial. It passed, but narrowly.
Weren't there allegations of irregularities, voter fraud, media bias in the campaign?
There were widespread reports and criticisms along those lines, yes. Concerns about the fairness of the vote, the tilted playing field. It further fueled worries about the direction Turkey was heading. Comparisons to authoritarian leaders became much more frequent after that.
And after that shift, did the pressure on political opponents increase?
It appears so. The sources detail continued targeting of opposition groups, particularly the pro-Kurdish HDP party, but also secular opponents.
Accusations of terrorism, sedition, leading to arrests.
Yes, those kinds of charges became more common tools, critics say, to sideline political rivals.
Like the case of Selahattin Demirtas, the HEB leader.
His case is probably the most high profile. A charismatic Kurdish politician imprisoned since 2016. Human rights groups, the EU, the European Court of Human Rights, have all called the charges politically motivated and demanded his release.
But he remains imprisoned.
Yes. And his ongoing detention is often highlighted as a symbol of the crackdown on dissent and the erosion of rule of law in these kinds of cases.
Let's switch gears a bit to the economy. Turkey had strong growth earlier under the AKP, but things have gotten tougher recently.
Definitely tougher. High inflation has been a persistent problem. The Turkish lira has lost a lot of value. Unemployment has been a concern.
And Erdoğan's economic policies have been, well, unconventional.
Right.
Especially regarding the central bank.
Very unconventional, particularly his insistence on low interest rates even when inflation is soaring. That goes against mainstream economic thinking.
And he's exerted a lot of influence over the central bank, firing governors who disagreed.
Yes, there's been significant turnover at the top of the central bank. Critics argue this undermines the bank's independence and credibility, and that prioritizing loyalty or a specific ideology over economic expertise has actually made Turkey's economic problems worse.
There are also those allegations about state contracts favoring his inner circle.
Those allegations of cronyism and corruption in awarding contracts have been persistent, yes, adding another layer to the economic concerns.
Okay, what about foreign policy? Turkey, under Erdoğan, has been very assertive on the world stage.
Very assertive, sometimes quite unpredictable. You see military interventions in Syria, for example.
Justified as counterterrorism, but criticized for other motives.
Right. The government frames them as fighting terrorism and securing borders. Critics, especially internationally, often see them as attempts to suppress Kurdish aspirations for autonomy across the border and potentially destabilizing.
And the relationship with traditional allies like NATO has become strained,
Quite strained at times, especially over things like Turkey buying the Russian S-400 missile system. That caused huge friction with the US and NATO.
raising questions about Turkey's alignment, flirting with Russia while being in NATO.
Exactly. It feeds into this narrative of Erdoğan pursuing a more independent, sometimes oppositional foreign policy, playing different powers off against each other. Opportunistic, some would call it.
And finally, we should touch on those claims of nepotism, closer to home.
Yes, allegations involving his own family. His son-in-law, Berat Albayrak, serving as finance minister during a particularly turbulent economic period, drew a lot of attention and criticism.
The perception being that family ties played a role in key appointments.
That's the core of the nepotism charge. That competence might take a backseat to loyalty and family connections, raising concerns about transparency and good governance. It fits into that broader pattern of consolidating control within a trusted circle.
So when you pull it all together, Erdoğan is just incredibly polarizing.
Deeply polarizing. For his supporters, he's the strong leader who restored national pride, stood up for religious conservatives, boosted Turkey's influence, a real champion.
But for critics,
For critics, he's the figure who has systematically dismantled Turkish democracy, crushed dissent, overseen corruption, and divided the country. An authoritarian.
two completely different narratives.
Starkly different, and his legacy is still being written, still fiercely contested inside Turkey and outside. It's genuinely hard to find consensus.
It really is. The complexity, the contradictions over time and power are undeniable.
Definitely. The sources we've looked at really highlight those contrasting views and the huge impact he's had on Turkey's